There comes a moment in the arc of human consciousness where the old engines of excitement begin to run quietly, not because life has lost its color, but because awareness has widened beyond the perimeter where those engines once mattered. People look at the same sports they once lived and died for and feel a strange neutrality rising in them. A drifting distance that isn't boredom and isn't apathy. It is a recognition that something inside has outgrown the emotional hooks that used to pull so easily. The thrill that once lit the body with momentum now feels like a faint echo of a younger self. A version of consciousness that fed on adrenaline, rivalry, and the rush of belonging to something larger than oneself. But as awareness expands, belonging begins to come from a deeper place, and the temporary tribalism of sports no longer gives the nourishment it once did. Human beings have always used collective games as mirrors. At first, the mirror is irresistible. A field of symbols, heroes, victories, losses, and arcs that feel mythic enough to stand in for one's own life. People pour their emotions into teams because the human psyche is designed to anchor itself in stories. And sports deliver ready-made narratives that feel alive. They offer a sense of identity without requiring self-discovery, a sense of passion without requiring internal ignition, a sense of community without requiring genuine vulnerability. For many, sports are the first place where they learn to feel intensity without risking themselves. But as consciousness matures, the soul begins to crave authenticity over simulation. The thrill of watching another person succeed eventually becomes a faint substitute for the deeper thrill of becoming someone who succeeds in their own field of life. And that shift is subtle at first. The game still looks the same, but the internal reason for caring begins to dissolve. Something else begins to happen as awareness grows. People start to see the architecture behind the experiences that used to move them. They start to notice how sports depend on emotional compulsion, how they rely on the rise and fall of adrenaline, how they thrive on rivalry, conflict, and a heightened sense of identity separation. They start to see how the crowd is guided into collective spikes of emotion, and how the entire system hinges on keeping attention externally focused, perpetually charged, and always hungry for the next victory or the next controversy. This clarity isn't cynical. It is simply the vision that comes when the veil of immersion lifts. Once a person sees the mechanics behind the magic, the spell breaks, not in disappointment but in understanding. They realize that the excitement was never purely theirs. It was partly manufactured by structures designed to harness their focus and emotional energy. As people move into higher states of self-awareness, a new form of engagement begins to awaken. Instead of seeking intensity from outside sources, the inner world becomes more compelling. Passion shifts from observation to creation. Instead of anchoring identity in a team, people start anchoring identity in their path, their growth, their becoming. They feel less interested in watching someone else aim for excellence, and more interested in discovering what excellence might look like within themselves. This is not ego, it is evolution. When inner life expands enough, outer entertainment loses its grip. Not because it is meaningless, but because it becomes too small to hold the full scale of what the soul is now pursuing. Sports also rely on predictable cycles, seasons, rivalries, championships, rebuilds. The narratives repeat, the arcs repeat, the emotions repeat. At earlier stages of life, repetition is comforting because it provides rhythm and structure. But as awareness deepens, repetition begins to feel like stagnation. People sense that the emotional energy they pour into cyclic narratives could be used to build something lasting in their own lives. They begin to feel how much of their time, focus, and emotional bandwidth was being invested in outcomes that changed nothing about their actual path. The realization doesn't come with regret, but with a quiet recalibration. They start to understand the cost of attention. And once that understanding crystallizes, they become far more selective about where they place it. Another shift occurs in the emotional body. As consciousness matures, people begin to prefer coherence over turbulence. Sports are built on turbulence. Sudden highs, sudden lows, spikes of tension, surges of disappointment, bursts of celebration. These emotional swings feel exhilarating to younger minds because intensity feels like meaning, and adrenaline feels like life. But eventually people realize that intensity and meaning are not the same, and adrenaline is not the only form of aliveness. With growth comes a desire for steadiness, clarity, and resonance. The nervous system begins rejecting unnecessary turbulence. What once felt thrilling starts to feel draining. Emotional equilibrium becomes more valuable than emotional eruption. The drama that once felt like a release begins to feel like noise. People also start to see how much of sports culture is built on inherited loyalty. Most fans are fans because someone they loved was a fan first. A parent, a sibling, a friend, a community. They took on the team as an identity marker before they were old enough to understand what identity even was. But as consciousness widens, individuals begin to release the identities they did not consciously choose. They no longer feel the need to carry the emotional weight of a team whose victories and losses do nothing to evolve their inner world. This is one of the deepest reasons interest fades. The soul begins shedding borrowed identities. What remains is only what was chosen authentically. There is also the emergence of the witness state, a shift from being the character inside the emotional scene to being the observer of the scene itself. Once observation becomes stable, the emotional hooks that sports depend on lose their power. People begin watching the crowd instead of watching the game. They notice the entrainment of attention, the ritualized movements of the group, the collective surges of emotion. They start to see the event as an energetic structure rather than an immersive experience. With that clarity, the desire to participate in the structure weakens. They are not above it, but they are outside it. And being outside of it makes participation feel optional instead of natural. What actually happens is not a loss of interest, but a redistribution of energy. As consciousness expands, people naturally reallocate their focus toward the areas of life where their presence has impact. They start caring more about their healing, their expression, their creativity, their purpose, their relationships, their evolution. They recognize that energy is finite and meaning is created, not consumed. They begin to invest in what builds them rather than what distracts them. And because sports are designed to consume attention without producing personal growth, the energy that once flowed into them begins flowing into more meaningful pursuits. None of this means sports are unimportant. They remain a vital field for millions, places of joy, community, inspiration, physical mastery, and shared celebration. But not every stage of consciousness resonates with the same structures. People do not grow out of sports as if leaving childish things behind. They simply shift into a frequency where the old patterns no longer match their internal horizon. They begin craving depth over distraction, participation over observation, creation over consumption, resonance over adrenaline. The truth is simple. When a person begins to sense the magnitude of their own becoming, the entertainment built around other people's becoming loses its power. The soul leans toward what awakens it, and eventually, watching someone else chase victory cannot compete with the quiet, undeniable pull to become victorious within oneself. As consciousness keeps unfolding, people begin to recognize that their attention is one of the rarest currencies they possess. Not because the world demands it, but because their inner world suddenly becomes a place they can no longer abandon. There is a dawning awareness that every moment of focus is either strengthening an inner architecture or scattering itself across narratives that never return the investment. For many, the slow fading of interest in sports marks the beginning of this deeper reclamation. They start noticing that their mind no longer wants to orbit around statistics, predictions, rankings, or rivalries that have no bearing on their becoming. The hooks loosen naturally, not because they force detachment, but because their consciousness begins to prefer nourishment over stimulation. A person who is awakening begins to feel their inner life stretching outward, reaching for richer experiences, deeper conversations, and more resonant expressions of self. They realize they are no longer satisfied by the emotional cycle of anticipation and disappointment that sports constantly generate. What once felt like intensity now reveals itself as repetition. The mind begins to crave novelty of meaning instead of novelty of outcome. Watching a new match no longer feels like watching a new story. It feels like watching a familiar structure reshuffle itself. This recognition doesn't carry bitterness. It carries clarity. The soul simply stops confusing emotional spikes with emotional depth. With this shift comes a subtler one, a growing sensitivity to the way mass attention moves. People begin to see how collective focus is intentionally directed, amplified, and harvested. Sports become a lens through which they witness the choreography of collective emotion. They notice how millions of people can be guided into the same state at the same time, how whole cities rise and fall on the outcomes of strangers' performances, how the system thrives on emotional attachment that keeps people looking outward instead of inward. This isn't a conspiracy realization, it is an energetic one. They sense the scale of human potential that remains untapped because so much personal power is poured into structures that never return anything but temporary highs. At this stage, the idea of caring deeply about something that never evolves with them begins to feel foreign. People who are growing internally start wanting a relationship with the world that mirrors their own expansion. They want their interests to expand as they do. They want their passions to mature as they mature. Sports by design do not grow with the individual. They stay the same. The field stays the same. The rules stay the same. The drama resets each season to maintain emotional engagement without ever demanding inner evolution from the spectator. Once a person recognizes this, an internal realignment occurs. They realize they have changed and the game has not, and in that realization the bond dissolves. Human beings naturally evolve toward purpose when they begin following their inner signals. Purpose does not always appear dramatic or mystical. Sometimes it appears as a quiet disinterest in things that once consumed countless hours. People begin noticing that the same energy they used to spend analyzing games, comparing players, arguing statistics, and tracking narratives can now be used to build something meaningful. They feel the pull toward creating their own stories instead of attaching themselves to the stories of others. The desire to produce begins to outweigh the desire to consume. This marks a critical turning point in their awakening. Attention stops being a commodity and becomes a resource used intentionally. Another underlying shift is that as people heal emotionally, they no longer seek external intensity to feel alive. Sports often provide an unconscious outlet for emotions that individuals have not yet learned to express or process within themselves. Victory gives them a sense of triumph they have not yet cultivated internally. Defeat gives them a place to release frustration they have not yet understood. Rivalry gives them a sense of identity when their real identity still feels unformed. As healing progresses, these emotional displacements dissolve. Individuals start to feel their own triumphs and losses more directly, and the emotional catharsis that sports once provided no longer feels necessary. They begin to experience their life as the primary arena, and this naturally reduces the significance of everything performed on external stages. They also develop a deeper relationship with stillness. Not the absence of motion, but the presence of awareness. Stillness reveals how much of modern entertainment culture is designed to prevent people from sitting with themselves. Sports fill the spaces where introspection might arise. They fill weekends, evenings, conversations, and silences. But when a person becomes comfortable with stillness, they no longer need those fillers. They begin to value the quiet moments that once felt uncomfortable. The noise of constant entertainment gives way to a desire for presence, reflection, and intentional engagement. In that environment, the endless cycle of games feels intrusive rather than inviting. Another transformation occurs when people begin to understand the difference between admiration and inspiration. Admiration keeps the individual at a distance, celebrating someone else's greatness from afar. Inspiration invites the individual to explore their own capacity for greatness. Sports thrive on admiration. Fans idolize athletes, teams, and institutions. But awakening shifts admiration into inspiration. People begin to ask themselves what they might become if they invested the same passion into their own path that they once invested into a team. They start to feel the quiet discomfort of unrealized potential, not in a harsh way, but in a motivating one. Something in them whispers that their life is asking for more than observation. It is asking for participation. This realization is often followed by a release of comparison. Sports culture unconsciously trains people to measure worth through performance, competition, and ranking. But as consciousness expands, comparison becomes less meaningful. People begin to see that each path is unique, each journey irreducible, each soul incomparable. They lose interest in narratives built entirely on who is better, faster, stronger, or more dominant. Their values shift from domination to expression, from competition to creation, from winning to evolving. With this shift, the basic premise of many competitive structures begins to feel outdated. They no longer resonate with the idea that someone has to lose in order for someone else to win. Awakening also deepens empathy. People begin to feel the emotional, physical, and psychological cost placed on athletes who are expected to carry the weight of millions of strangers. Expectations. They sense the pressure, the exploitation, the commodification of bodies and performances. They see the humanity inside the spectacle. Once this empathy activates, the entertainment becomes harder to consume without awareness. The spectacle becomes transparent and the emotional distance collapses. The person watching begins to care more about the well-being of individuals than the outcome of games. And this alone can dissolve the pull to participate in the culture around it. Over time, the fading interest in sports becomes just one layer of a larger evolution. People begin noticing the same shift across multiple domains: entertainment, social division, celebrity culture, tribal identities. They see how much of human society is built on structures that feed on attention, without feeding the soul. They begin seeking experiences that carry depth, truth, and resonance. They crave learning, creation, healing, and contribution. Their inner world becomes more compelling than the performances designed to capture their outer attention. Eventually, they realize that the shift was never about sports at all. It was about expansion. It was about the soul outgrowing the frameworks that once contained it. It was about consciousness stepping into a new rhythm, where entertainment no longer competes with becoming, and where the desire to watch others rise cannot compare to the quiet, powerful urge to rise within oneself.